Chapter 1052. Li Yi's body swayed, and he gently supported her before she fell to the ground. He held her back with one hand and carried her horizontally with the other hand under her legs. He turned his head and saw Mississippi Lu looking at him. He looked at the unconscious Yang Liuqing, then raised his head to look at Mississippi Lu and asked, "How about, you do it?" Xianxia was located at the border of the Wu Kingdom with the Thorns Ridge as the boundary. Further north was the chaotic land beyond the jurisdiction of the government. Ever since the current emperor massacred the imperial capital and sat on the throne, heroes had risen within the borders of the Wu Kingdom. The government's control over the prefectures far away from the imperial capital had been greatly weakened. For a long time, Xianxia had been occupied by the former border army loyal to the late emperor. Several generals who were loyal to the late emperor and the only princess of the empress wanted to overthrow the court and make the son of the late emperor, Prince Jing, the new emperor. Of course, this was all old history. Not long ago, the border army forces that Princess Duanrong belonged to had been wiped out by the court and several enlistment forces. They had suffered a crushing defeat and their troops were scattered. Princess Duanrong and the young Prince Jing had also disappeared, and Xianxia was once again under the control of the court. The common people of Xianxia inwardly felt regret. When Her Highness the Princess was still alive, she purged the bandits, sympathized with the common people and helped the poor. Now that Xianxia had once again fallen into the hands of the court, their future days would be difficult. The current emperor was cruel and merciless. He killed his brother and father, and he didn't even let off the princess and prince who shared the same mother. It was said that last night, the government had dispatched more than 2,000 soldiers to encircle and suppress Princess Duanrong in the Thorns Ridge. The common people didn't dare to make a sound, but they were secretly indignant. Weren't these heartless people not afraid of the wrath of the heavens? Speaking of the wrath of the heavens, last night, around midnight, the Thorns Ridge was filled with heavenly thunder and flames soared to the sky. The deafening noise could be heard even in Xianxia City. That night, many people in the city were awakened, their hearts trembling. In the morning there was news that last night, the government had dispatched more than 2,000 soldiers to encircle and suppress Princess Duanrong, but they hadn't returned. Immediately, countless people guessed that their actions must have angered the heavens, causing the gods to be enraged and send down heavenly lightning and earthly fire, leaving all those people there. Of course, these were all rumors. At this moment, at the foot of the Thorns Ridge, there was a group of people looking at the tragic scene of corpses strewn all over the mountain, and they couldn't help but vomit. Dead, they're all dead, even General Wei and General Shao. Quick, quick, send a message to the royal capital. In the Bedlam lands there was a winding mountain road that spiraled up the mountainside. At the front were several carriages and behind them were nearly 100 people. Wei Liang finally knew why the Wan brothers and the others were forced to repair the road. The winding mountain paths of the fringe that were difficult to traverse were now smooth and comfortable. They could even travel in carriages. The injured princess was in the carriage at the front. In this half a day he had also learned an unbelievable piece of news from the people around him. The ownerless Bedlam now had a master. The entire Bedlam lands was now in their pocket. If it wasn't for the princess, even if he, Wei Liang, once led an army of 100,000 soldiers, he wouldn't be able to escape the fate of repairing roads and bridges like the Wan brothers. He looked ahead and was puzzled. What kind of existence was the master of Her Highness the Princess? Li Yi leaned on a carriage, glanced at the carriage in front of him, and continued to close his eyes to rest. Now that Mississippi Lu's precious disciple had been found, he didn't have to worry about her anymore, nor did he have to worry about her doing anything impulsive. Yang Liuqing was injured, but fortunately it wasn't serious. He would be able to recover after a period of rest. They were now heading to the stronghold where Rui and Ruoqing Zumo were, which was about a day's journey away from here. At some point, the curtain of the carriage was lifted by a withered palm, revealing the figure of an old man. Li Yi had seen him once on the first day, but they had never spoken. After the old man lifted the curtain, he moved a little to the edge of the carriage. The old man was slightly injured in the conflict a few days ago, and his head was still wrapped in a white cloth. After experiencing the bumpy ride of the past few days, he looked a little weak. The old man looked at him, pondered for a moment and asked, "May I ask if you are Li Yi of Jianghu of Silla?" This old man had been in a half-conscious state for a few days, and he only woke up today. Li Yi was a little surprised. Could it be that the name of Jianghu of Silla had already spread out of the Jing kingdom and started to spread to the world? Li Yi didn't deny it, and the old man didn't seem to need him to admit it either. He sized him up and said, "I've long heard of the name Jianghu of Silla, but I didn't expect the famous Jianghu of Silla to be so young. What a young hero, Li cupped his hands in obeisance. You flatter me. Just as he was waiting for the old man to continue, the old man put down the curtain and didn't say anything else. Li was a little disappointed. This old man didn't finish his sentence. He was so old, but he still didn't know any etiquette. According to the usual routine, shouldn't he first praise him for being handsome and capable? Then he should express his endless admiration for him? Finally, he should say that it was his honor to know the famous King Jing and ask if they could be friends in the future so that they could exchange contact information or something like that. With this kind of emotional intelligence, how could he be a prime minister? The old man in front of him was the prime minister of a country. This was what Li Yi had learned from the general named Wei Liang. When the emperor of the Wu kingdom killed his brother and father to usurp the throne, there was a wave of righteous people who jumped out to oppose him. Although this old man didn't stand out to oppose him directly, he secretly sent Yang Liuqing and Prince Jing out of the imperial capital. Later on, he even quietly left the imperial court to help them build up their power step by step and fight against the imperial court. Of course, he worked hard day and night, worked hard for several years and suffered a defeat. Now he was back to square one. At his age, he still had to run around and worry so much for a certain belief in his heart. Li still had some respect for him. Prime Minister, I want to see my sister. A youth's voice came from the carriage. The old man said softly, the princess is injured. Your Highness, please bear with it for one more day. Wait until tomorrow. Li Yi knew that the youth in the carriage was Prince Jing, who was also Yang Liuqing's younger brother. He was the person they wanted to support to become the emperor of the Wu kingdom. That night, when the imperial court soldiers attacked the mountain, he seemed to have fainted from fear. This was normal. After all, he was only 13 or 14 years old. He was about to lose his life, so it would be strange if he wasn't scared. After all, not everyone was as mature as Li Han. When he was 11 or 12 years old, he could manage an entire mathematics academy. This year he was only 14 years old, but he had already become one of the big shots in the imperial court. Even the current prime minister and the 6 ministers had to completely listen to him on certain matters. Of course, children of the same age and the same prince were in completely different situations. One was the most famous genius child in the Jing kingdom, the dean of the mathematics academy, and an influential figure in the imperial court. According to a letter from Li Xian a few days ago, the former mathematics department of the imperial college wanted to leave the mathematics academy and establish their own school. Li Han gladly agreed, but the condition was that they could pass his test. In the end, everyone failed on the test paper that Li Han gave them. Including the professors and even the Minister of Mathematics, no one from the mathematics department of the Imperial College passed the test. As for the test paper, after a few teachers from the academy looked at the solution given by Li Han, they said that the solution was only a little complicated and did not exceed the limits of the Imperial Court. Li remembered that when he received the letter from the Dragon Boat Festival, he had asked him to come up with a few complicated math problems to give Li Han a hard time. To prevent Li Han from always showing off in front of him, Li Yi had randomly come up with a few. It was a little complicated, but Li Han was not a person who could be measured by common sense. He had actually found all of the more than 30 auxiliary lines of the geometry problem. I'm not saying that you are trash. What I mean is that everyone here is trash. This was what Li Han said to the Minister of Mathematics in front of all the teachers and students in the Mathematics Academy. It was said that at that time, the Minister of Mathematics trembled with anger. The faces of the mathematics department turned green. The situation was out of control. Li Han was completely blessed by the heavens. If he wrote a few books based on his own experiences, 14 years old, why am I so outstanding? You're flattering me, I'm just a genius. From a rebellious boy to the dean of the Mathematics Academy, the growth of a genius youth. This book would definitely be sold out in the Jing Kingdom. In comparison, this young man named Yang Fu was also treated specially by the heavens. When he was 10 years old, his second brother killed his father and eldest brother and forced his mother to die. His older sister brought him to hide from the imperial court. She also had to shoulder the great responsibility of restoring the country and taking revenge. It was really not easy. Since ancient times, there were many people who successfully rebelled. However, there were even more who were suppressed and killed. With only a few hundred people under their command, it was easier said than done to overthrow a country. Li Yi sighed. To be honest, he hoped that she could let go of these things and live a happy and stable life as an ordinary person. However, when he thought of her dedication and craziness in practicing martial arts, it would be very difficult to achieve this. Moreover, he could not control the life that she chose. In the carriage at the front, Yang Liuqing leaned against the carriage and looked down at Mississippi Lu. She said in a low voice, "Master, I'm sorry." Mississippi Lu looked at her and said coldly, "You left without a word for 3 years without any news. A simple apology is enough. Do you still see me as your master?" Yang Liuqing's face turned pale. She panicked and said, "Master, you can hit me or scold me, but don't chase me out." Mississippi Lu looked at her and raised her hand. Yang Liuqing raised her head and closed her eyes. Smack. A crisp sound came from the carriage. Yang Liuqing opened her eyes. After a moment of shock, she covered her butt and blushed. "Don't do it again." Mississippi Lu glanced at her and jumped out of the carriage. Chapter 1053. One of Yang Liuqing's arms was injured. On the way, Mississippi Lu had already treated the wound for her. The carriage couldn't directly enter the village, so Li Yi had to carry her on his back for the distance from the carriage to the village. Even if Wei and Chen had 10 guts, they wouldn't dare to be intimate with Her Royal Highness. It couldn't be helped. However, Mississippi Lu was his disciple. Why should he carry her on his back? Although she was his martial niece and could be considered as half a family, but in the end there were differences between men and women. Even Bai Su, who had no breasts, no buttocks and was narrow-minded, following behind Mississippi Lu, was stronger than him. Although she looked petite and weak, her strength could be ranked in the top 10 of the heaven list. Li Yi was sure that she could definitely beat 10 of him. Carrying him up the mountain was not a problem at all. Speaking of Bai Su, Li Yi always felt that this woman had a faint hostility towards him. It wasn't just because he accidentally touched her non-existent breasts last time. That look in her eyes, it seemed, as if he had stolen her man. After she looked at him with that kind of look for the umpteenth time, Li Yi finally couldn't stand it anymore. He glanced at her flat chest and said seriously, "I like women." This explained that touching her chest last time was purely an accident. After all, compared to Rui, she could only be considered as half a woman. It also explained that he wouldn't steal her man. There was only one man who usually hung around her. Did this girl like Fong? Bai Su looked at him with a resentful look. She gritted her teeth and said, "Me too." Li Yi was stunned on the spot. Did she mean that although she had no breast, she was still a woman, implying that he could like her? Or, did she like women as much as he did? Should be the former. He sighed. There were so many women in the world. He couldn't fall in love with everyone he met. It was enough to take care of the few women in his family. He could only let the thousands of women represented by Bai Su be sad and disappointed. Yang Liuqing was arranged to stay in the prince's mansion. Rui and the others had already received the news. They were talking in her room. Li Yi stretched his muscles and walked out of the mansion. The most important thing for her now was to recuperate. It would take about a few months to recover to her peak state. When she was better, Zumo and the others should also be tired of living in the mountain. Then they would return to Shuzhou together. As for other things, they would take their time to consider. Wei Liang and Chen Qing stood on the dustless street paved with blue stones. They looked at the bustling crowd and the rows of shops on both sides of the street in a daze. A hawker carrying a pole passed by them, and the sound of reading came from the school not far away. They even saw a rough man walking while shaking his head and reciting the words, "Raise your head to look at the bright moon, lower your head to think of your hometown." For a moment they even thought that they had come to the imperial capital. No, this place was cleaner and tidier than the imperial capital. It looked even more prosperous than the imperial capital. There were many things that they had never even heard of in the street shops. There was actually such a place in the chaotic land where bandits were rampant and everyone despised it? They suddenly felt a little inferior. Yang Fu did not feel inferior. He swallowed and stood in front of a small stall on the street. It was called a small stall, but it was actually a small moving cart with a glass box on it. He had seen glass before, but he had never seen such a big glass box, and he had never seen people using glass as a box to sell things. Inside the transparent glass box was food that he had never seen before. It was strung together on skewers and looked crystal clear. He knew that it was food because there was a little fatty of his age next to him who was holding a skewer and licking it happily. The little fatty looked at the young man who was standing in front of the candied hawthorn and asked, "Do you want to eat candied hawthorn? It's 2 copper coins per skewer. You can choose any skewer you want. Buy 5 skewers and get 1 free." Only then did Yang Fu know that this thing was called candied hawthorn. He was a prince. In the past he could eat whatever he wanted. Things that flew in the sky, swam in the water, and all kinds of delicacies. But that was in the past. Later on, when he traveled around the various states, he had more opportunities to eat vegetables. The crystal clear thing in front of him seemed to be more delicious than any delicacies he had eaten before. He had no money and he had never touched money. The little fatty looked at him and scratched his head. He took out a candied hawthorn from the box and handed it to him. He said, "My name is Lin Hu. They all call me Fat Tiger. I have never seen you in the stockade. This candied hawthorn is for you. Let's be friends." Yang Fu looked at him, and a trace of anger suddenly appeared on his face. He hit the candied hawthorn to the ground. He was King Jing, the future emperor of the Wu kingdom. How could he accept the charity of a lowly commoner? How could he be friends with a lowly commoner? The little fatty's hand that was holding the candied hawthorn was still extended forward. He did not expect such a big reaction from xuanhuan. He looked at him in a daze. Yang Fu fiercely stepped on the candied hawthorn a few times and said angrily, "I don't want to eat your stupid candied hawthorn, and I don't want to be friends with you. I don't want to be friends with you either." The little fatty looked at the candied hawthorn that he had stepped on and sniffed. He looked at xuanhuan and said, "You have to pay." Yang Fu glanced at him and said disdainfully, "I won't pay." The little fatty frowned and said, "You are making things difficult for me, Fat Tiger." Yang Fu raised his eyebrows. "So what if I make things difficult for you?" The little fatty looked down at the mess on the ground and said, "Then do you dare to spit on the ground again?" Bah! Yang Fu spat on the ground and looked at him. He said disdainfully, "I will spit." "So what?" The little fatty turned around and waved at a man wearing a red armband on the street. He said, "I want to report someone. Someone spits on the ground and litters everywhere." The man quickly walked over and asked, "His Highness is back, but he still dares to commit crimes. Little brother, tell me who is so unethical." The little fatty pointed at the youth opposite him and said, "It's him. Whose family's little brat is this? It's time to teach him a lesson." The burly man said as he tucked the handsome but immoral little brat under his arm. He then turned around and walked towards the direction of the school. Let me go, let me go. How dare you? I will punish you." Yang Fu was almost vomited by the strong smell of a fox. His face turned green and his limbs flailed wildly. "Stop. Let go of His Highness." Two shouts rang in his ears. He had just taken 2 steps when he found 2 figures in front of him, glaring at him. "A rebellion." The big man did not let go of the youth under his arm and said loudly, "Brothers, someone is rebelling." Crash. The door of the opposite building was pushed open. 10 or so men with red armbands walked out and surrounded Wei Liang and Qin Qin. Their expressions immediately changed and their momentum immediately weakened. They looked at the big man and said, "Put His Highness down first. We can talk, talk my ass. This little brat litters everywhere and is unhygienic. We should discipline him on behalf of his parents." Cough. Cough. An old man walked over from behind and asked, "What happened?" Li Yi had been standing far away from the beginning. He slowly walked over and looked at the old man and said, "This is the rule here. Those who urinate, spit, and litter everywhere need to attend class and complete a test as punishment." The old man nodded and said, "There are no rules. Since we are here, we must abide by the rules here." He looked at the big man and nodded. "Thank you. I don't want to attend class and I don't want to take a test." Yang Fu was still struggling when he was taken away by the big man. Prime Minister Wang said. Wei Liang and Qin Qing looked at each other and did not stop him. The old man watched Yang Fu be taken away by the big man. Then he looked at Li Yi and asked doubtfully, "I have never heard of such a punishment. Is there a reason for it?" Li Yi nodded and said, "Most of the people in this stockade have never studied. Making them attend class and take a test is much more useful than giving them silver or corporal punishment. They would rather starve outside than go in and study. Once they experience this kind of punishment once, they will never do it again." The old man was stunned, then he smiled and said, "Wonderful, really wonderful. To think that you can come up with such a wonderful method. Jiang of Silla is really a god. You flatter me." As the two of them were exchanging pleasantries, the big man walked out with Yang Fu. He scratched his head gloomily and looked at Li Yi. He said, "Just in time for the test. This kid has actually studied and can write all 5 words. He thought that it had taken him 2 months to come out, but this kid had only used less than 15 minutes. The big man was even more depressed. Yang Fu looked proud and said, "Isn't it just writing? What's so difficult about it?" The old man smiled and looked at Li Yi. He said, "Although this method is wonderful, it has its limits. For those who have studied, there are not many restrictions. Instead, it will help them. Jiang of Silla should think of another punishment method." Li Yi shook his head and said, "Prime Minister, you are wrong. Rewards and punishments need to be measured. How can blindly punishing people without rewards be the solution?" The old man thought for a moment and nodded. What Jiang of Silla said makes sense. For such a young child it is better to guide him. Rewards and punishments are the right way to go. He touched Yangfu's head and said, "You did very well in the test this time. You should be rewarded. I have a book called Elementary Mathematics. It is a secret textbook of the Jing Kingdom School of Mathematics. There are 100 classic examples in it. If you can solve all of them, you will be able to see the door of mathematics." Li Han, the king of Jin, started from this book and became the dean of the Jing Kingdom School of Mathematics. "I don't pass this book to ordinary people, but this time it is your reward." He pointed at Yangfu and turned to look at the big man. He said, "Take him to the confinement room. I will ask someone to send the elementary mathematics over. Watch him personally and don't come out until he is done." Chapter 1054. Li Han and Yangfu were about the same age and they were both princes. Therefore, Li Yi would always compare the two of them, whether intentionally or unintentionally. The result of the comparison proved a problem. There was still a gap between people and princes. At the same age, one of them was already in charge of a mathematics school, stirring up the court, reaching the peak of his career, but he was still flirting with girls and could even roast good fish. The other one was still showing off his power as a prince because of a candied hawthorn. It was obvious who was better. Of course, this was also related to their respective circumstances. Li Han was a genius, and in the eyes of almost all his peers, he was someone else's child. He couldn't be used as a standard, as this would be a blow to more than 99% of people. Although Yangfu was a prince, he had suffered much more than a normal child. Unfortunately, these hardships and setbacks didn't hone his inhuman state of mind. Instead, they made him more extreme and violent. This was the impression Li Yi had of him after a few days of observation. He didn't care much about this. After all, he was still a child. As long as his nature wasn't bad, there was still a chance for him to change. Of course, this was the responsibility of Yang Liuqing and Prime Minister Wang. He didn't have this obligation. "Let me out, let me out. This question is too difficult, too difficult. I don't know it, I don't know it. I was wrong, I shouldn't have littered, I shouldn't have spat, I was wrong, let me out. Sister, sister, Prime Minister, General Qin, General Wei, help me." Hearing the screams coming from the confinement room, Li Yi shook his head and turned to leave. Although it was only elementary mathematics, it took Li Han a lot of time to completely understand the book with his help. If Yangfu studied it by himself, he probably wouldn't be able to solve half of the questions in his lifetime. His goal wasn't to let him solve the questions. This wasn't the Wu Kingdom and it wasn't the border army that was loyal to them. It wasn't a bad thing to temporarily suppress his arrogance. Wei Liang and Qin Qing stood outside the confinement room and looked at Imperial Prince Jing, who was frantically banging on the door. Wei Liang then turned to look at the old man and helplessly said, "Prime Minister, look this." The old man waved his hand and said, "Let's follow Jiang of Silla's arrangements first. It's good to dampen his spirit." Wei Liang looked at a figure in the distance and whispered, "Prime Minister, this is Jiang of Silla. This Jiang of Silla is an extraordinary person." The old man looked into the distance until Li Yi's figure disappeared. Then he said, "He has done a lot of great things. The talented Prince Jin of the Jing Kingdom was trained by him. Prince Jin is younger than Prince Jing, but he can already take charge of the court and command the wind and clouds." Sigh. He let out a long sigh as a desolate expression appeared on his face. Since he is a genius, how can he be trained? Wei Liang shook his head and said, "I don't think he is that powerful except for his good looks." The old man glanced at him and said, "If you still want the plum's art of war, that you have been dreaming of, you better not think that way." What? Wei Liang looked at him in surprise. Because that book was written by him. As soon as he finished speaking, Wei Liang, who was next to him, disappeared, leaving only a cloud of smoke that slowly dissipated. On the other side, the general named Qin Qing opened his mouth and looked at the old man. He asked in disbelief, "Prime Minister, did he really write the Plum's Art of War? How could it be? He is so young." Plum's Art of War was a magical book that existed in the hearts of the generals and soldiers of various countries in recent years. It was said that this book recorded countless ways to defeat the enemy on the battlefield. It was very mysterious. Unfortunately, this book was tightly controlled by the military of the Jing Kingdom and was not leaked to outsiders. They only heard of this book's name. They only knew that the armies of the Qi Kingdom and the Zhao Kingdom had suffered a lot because of this book. General Wei had admired this book for a long time. It was understandable that he couldn't control himself when he heard this news. Is it wrong to be young? The old man looked at him and asked, "Is the Emperor of the Jing Kingdom young? Is the Princess Royal who assists the government young? Is the third prince of the Qi Kingdom young? Is Prince Jin Li Hanyin young? His question made Qin Qing speechless. The emperor of the Jing kingdom devoted himself to developing the country with science and technology. The research of the Academy of Sciences had a lot of applications in agriculture and military formations. The Princess Royal of the Jing kingdom had the talent to rule the country. She was not inferior to any wise monarch that he could name. He had also heard about the deeds of the third prince of the Qi kingdom, Zhao Yi. As for Prince Jin of the Jing kingdom, Prime Minister Wang often mentioned this name, which often made him doubt that he had lived so many years in vain. These young people really didn't leave a way for the old people to live. However, he hadn't seen the book, so he didn't know whether it was true or not. He still felt that the heavenly punishment was easy to use. It was simple and straightforward. No military strategy could compare to a pile of heavenly punishment. Seeing his expression, the old man knew what he was thinking. He said, "I forgot to tell you that the heavenly punishment of the Jing kingdom was also made by the jianghu of Silla, Li Yi." He patted on Qin Qing's chest, where there was a scar that spread to his neck. "Also, if you really want to think about it, your life was also saved by the jianghu of Silla." The old man shook his head and said, "If it wasn't for the suturing method he proposed, you would have died on the battlefield because of excessive blood loss a year ago." Qin Qing opened his mouth, looked down at his chest, and was stunned. The old man sighed and looked at Prince Jing, who was still howling in the room. A thoughtful expression appeared on his face. After a long time he sighed again, turned around and left slowly. Li Yi sat on the stone bench in the yard, rubbing his eyebrows and thinking about something. Yang Liuqing was injured, so it was impossible for him to raise the flag to rebel in a short time. In the border army that had been loyal to her, besides the two generals, Wei Liang and Qin Qing, and less than 500 disabled soldiers, there was only an old man and a retarded younger brother who drooled at the sight of candied fruits. Mission objective: overthrow the rule of the tyrant of the Wu kingdom, establish a new imperial court, and help the retarded younger brother to ascend the throne. Mission progress: 0% mission conditions. A general, a deputy general, 500 disabled soldiers, an old man, a retarded younger brother, and herself. Mission difficulty: maximum, Your Highness Jiang of Silla. Wei Liang walked over slowly and rubbed his hands cautiously. He looked at Li Yi and thought for a long time. Finally, he plucked up his courage and asked, "Have you eaten?" Li Yi looked at him and shook his head helplessly. There was only one general and he was retarded. How could he play this game? There was no chance of winning. There were only a few people in the beginning and they didn't have any equipment, but they still wanted to overthrow a country. Even he, as her martial uncle, was worried about her. Plum's Art of War was actually a hodgepodge of things like 36 stratagems, 6 secret strategies, 3 strategies. After being organized and mixed together, it was named by the shameless Li Xian. This was actually not a secret. War could not be won by relying on a book on military strategy. The outside world's evaluation of this book was too high, and there was a lot of exaggeration. He took out a book from the study and lent it to Wei Liang. When he took the book, his hands were trembling. If not for Li Yi's support, he might have knelt down and kowtowed to him on the spot. After sending him off with great difficulty, Li Yi thought of something. He walked into the study and took out a brocade box from the cabinet. Then he walked out of the study and walked to the door of Yang Liuqing's room. He knocked on the door and walked in. "Martial uncle." Yang Liuqing sat up from the bed. Her voice was a little weak. "Don't. Just lie down." When Li Yi walked over, she was already sitting up. He handed the brocade box to her and said, "Last year, I met a businessman from the Wu kingdom. He said this was your mother's legacy. I don't know if it's true. Open it and take a look." When Yang Liuqing opened the brocade box and saw the phoenix hairpin, her body trembled. The next moment, her eyes were filled with tears and big drops of tears rolled down her cheeks. She bent her legs and wrapped her arms around her knees. At first, she sobbed softly, but soon she burst into tears. Li Yi gently patted her back. She was carrying so many things on her back. Crying out loud would help her release some of it, which was good for her body. "I've cooked porridge. Try it." Mississippi Lu walked in from outside with an exquisite tray in her hands. In the room beside the bed, the woman wrapped her arms around her knees and cried extremely sadly. It was as if she had made a vow with a man and was cruelly abandoned. Li Yi sat beside her. It was as if he had gotten a girl's body with sweet words and then abandoned her. Chapter 1055. Li Yi looked at Mississippi Lu, then got up and walked out. Although the situation in the room seemed to be easy to misunderstand, he believed that Rui wouldn't. Rui understood him. When he and Rui were in the Qi kingdom, When Rui was injured and couldn't fight back, he and Rui shared a room together. He didn't do anything out of line for a few months. Let's not talk about the past, let's talk about the recent events. On the day of the wedding he was locked out by Rui and the other two. Rui took him in. Both of them were drunk and slept on the same bed. Didn't he not take advantage of her? Third Miss Chin stood in the yard and watched Li Duan and Yong Ning play. When she saw Li Yi coming over she asked, "How's the girl?" "She's fine." Li Yi shook his head and said, "She's been through a lot. It's hard for her to hold it in. She'll be fine after crying." She nodded and said, "It's good that she's fine. I've heard from Rui about this little girl's background. I don't know how much suffering she's gone through to reach this stage. It's not easy." Li was very happy. Even if Rui didn't understand him, his godmother did. At least she wouldn't misunderstand him. Third Miss Chen looked at him and said, "This girl's life is pitiful. Don't let her down again." Li was stunned. When he came to his senses, he immediately explained, "Mother, what are you talking about?" I just saw you carrying her back." Li paused. That's..." Third Miss Chen waved her hand and said, Okay, I'm not blaming you. You're so capable. I'm happy that so many girls like you." Li looked up and saw that she had turned around and walked out. He hurriedly said, "Hey mother, don't go. Mother, listen to me." His godmother might have misunderstood him. No matter how he tried to explain, she just smiled. Li decided not to explain anymore. Time would prove his innocence. Yang Liuqing's younger brother, Yang Fu, seemed to have some misunderstanding towards him. These few days, he had been avoiding him whenever he saw him. Once, when he was sitting outside, he saw Yang Fu coming out of Yang Liuqing's courtyard. Halfway there, he noticed Yang Fu and immediately hid behind a big tree. He sat there thinking about the future management of the French. He also wrote letters to Li Xian, Mingzhu, Shanning, and the others. He sat there for more than 2 hours. Yang Fu hid behind the tree for another 2 hours. Before he left, he looked back and saw that Yang Fu had also come out from behind the tree. His pants were wet. Holding one's urine wasn't good for the body. A 14-year-old child actually held it in until he peed his pants. He could do it anywhere he wanted. Rules were dead, but people were alive. He couldn't just hold it in just because there was a rule that prohibited people from urinating or defecating anywhere they wanted. At most, he would be caught and forced to do some math problems. He had only completed less than 10 problems in the basic mathematics set. It took him 3 days. Li wasn't a rigid person. He asked the man to let him out. If he couldn't finish it, he could do it slowly. After all, there would be plenty of opportunities. Yang Fu was still young and didn't understand the value of basic mathematics. On the other hand, the old man named Wang treated it like a treasure. These days he often brought the book to Li Yi for advice. Any old man who could sit in the position of prime minister at his age was not someone to be trifled with. The questions he asked were all beyond the concepts and standards of this world's mathematics. After all, the mathematics standards of the Wu Kingdom had been surpassed by the Jing Kingdom by a lot. Not only did the Wu Kingdom not have any new mathematics, but the Wu Kingdom also didn't have any perfume or liquor. The Wu Kingdom didn't even have candied fruits. Mathematics didn't belong to Li Yi, nor did it belong to the Jing Kingdom's Mathematics Institute. Li didn't mind the old man implementing it in the Wu Kingdom after he learned it. Of course, he was only a prime minister now, so he couldn't implement it even if he wanted to. "Thank you, Jiang of Silla, for answering my questions." The old man put away the basic mathematics book that was almost torn to pieces. He stood up and said, "I'm going to see the princess." Li waved his hand and said, "She hasn't fully recovered yet. Prime Minister, be careful with your words." "I know." The old man nodded his head and turned to leave. When the old man walked in, there were still a few people in Yang Liuqing's room. Yang Fujing stood in front of the bed and said pitifully, "Sister, I don't want to go to the confinement room anymore. I don't want to do mathematics either. Let's go back, okay?" In the past few days he finally realized one thing. This wasn't the Wu Kingdom, nor was it the military. Other than Wei Liang and Qin Qin, no one treated him as King Jing. No one would listen to his orders. He just spat on the ground and was thrown into a dark room to calculate problems for 3 days. What kind of problems were those? Who would want to solve them? However, he had to do it. If he didn't do it, he wouldn't be given food. If he didn't eat, he would starve to death. Even his sister and the prime minister couldn't save him. Although there were a lot of delicious food and fun things he had never seen before, he didn't want to stay here for another day. He didn't want to see that person anymore. The old man walked over and looked at him. He smiled and said, "Your Highness, please go out and play for a while. I have something to discuss with the princess." Although Yang Fujing was unwilling, he pouted and left quickly. The Prime Minister and his sister definitely had something important to talk about. If he caused trouble at this time, his sister would punish him and the Prime Minister wouldn't be able to protect him. After Yang Fujing left, Wei Liang closed the door and stood at the door with Chen Qing. The old man walked to the bed and asked, "Your Highness, are you feeling better?" Yang Liuqing nodded. "I'm fine now. I'll recover after some rest." She leaned against the side of the bed and looked out the window. She said slowly, "Sangzhou has fallen back into the hands of the imperial court. General Fan and the others were scattered. I don't know where they are now," the old man comforted her. "General Fan won't fall into the hands of the imperial court so easily. Your Highness, just focus on recuperating. When you recover, we'll start all over again. You'll definitely be able to see General Fan again?" Yang Liuqing nodded slightly. The old man looked at him and suddenly said, "If Jiang of Silla?" "No." Before he could finish, he was interrupted by Yang Liuqing. Yang Luqing raised her head, looked at him and said seriously, "The Prime Minister said no." She knew what Prime Minister Wang wanted to say. Prime Minister Wang also knew what he wanted to say. A few years ago, Her Highness swore to practice martial arts for revenge. She hid it from them and secretly came to the Jing Kingdom. She stayed in the Jing Kingdom for a long time. During that period of time, in order to avoid being captured by the imperial court, they hid in the fringe. Even though they knew how naive the princess was at that time, no matter how skilled she was in martial arts, it was impossible for her to fight against an entire country alone. However, they failed to stop the princess. 2 years later, Her Highness returned. No one knew what His Highness had experienced in those 2 years. They only knew that His Highness's martial arts had improved by leaps and bounds. During battles, he would always take the lead and become a legend on the battlefield. He won the respect of all the soldiers and became their belief. It wasn't until a few days ago that he learned about the relationship between Her Highness and this Jiang of Silla. He was Jiang of Silla's martial nephew. Jiang of Silla's wealth was comparable to that of a country. He also possessed the method to create divine punishment. He also had a powerful and mysterious force in his hands. He even unified the vast fringe. In the Wu Kingdom, other than the imperial court, no other force could contend against him. More importantly, he was Jiang of Silla. Jiang of Silla Li, a man who repeatedly created miracles, a man who was good at creating miracles. If there was anyone who could help Her Highness accomplish this, that person was none other than Jiang of Silla. This was practically their last and greatest hope. "Your Highness." The old man looked at her and slowly knelt in front of her. His voice was deep. "Your Highness." Wei Liang and Chen Qing knelt down in front of her at the same time. Yang Liuqing looked at them with a pained expression. She shook her head and said, 3 years ago, I've let Master and Uncle Master down once. I can't let them down a second time." She turned to the 3 of them and said seriously, "Don't ever mention this again." Chapter 1056. Her Highness's attitude was very firm. The old man named Wang sighed and slowly stood up. He couldn't deny that he was deeply shocked by Jiang of Silla's wealth and influence. What kind of wealth would it take to build such a paradise in the land of chaos? What kind of tyrannical power would it take to unite the land of chaos that had been in chaos for hundreds of years in one fell swoop? They had divine punishment, divine weapons, and a group of powerful subordinates. If they could get his help, they wouldn't have to worry about not succeeding. But this matter could only be proposed by Her Highness. If Her Highness was unwilling, there was nothing he could do. He said apologetically, "This old subject was presumptuous. I hope Your Highness can forgive me." "It's fine." Yang Luqing shook her head and looked out of the window. The trees in the distant mountains were lush and there was an unknown fragrance of flowers drifting in from outside. She took a deep breath and a long-lost smile appeared on her face. "The plan to restore the dynasty can be discussed after Your Highness recovers." The old man named Wang paused for a moment before speaking again. "This old subject is worried about His Highness King Jing." Yang Liuqing looked at him and asked, "What's wrong with Yang Fu?" The old man sighed and said, "His Highness King Jing disappoints this old subject. He was originally just a little disappointed in King Jing. But ever since he came here and saw Jiang of Silla every day, he didn't dare to compare King Jing to Jiang of Silla. Instead, he couldn't help but think of Prince Jin. At first, he could use the excuse that King Jing was young and mischievous to deceive himself. But in terms of age, Prince Jin was even younger than King Jing, so how could he? Every time he thought of the gap between the two of them, the disappointment in his heart turned into despair. If King Jing continued like this, Even if they were lucky enough to seize power, from the perspective of the people of the Wu kingdom, it would be better to let the traitor who killed his brother and father become the emperor. Yang Liuqing sighed. A trace of disappointment inevitably appeared on her face, but it quickly disappeared. She smiled and said, Yang Fu is still young, and with the Prime Minister's guidance he will definitely change his naughty nature. The old man surnamed Wang nodded. He could only use this excuse to deceive himself. Yang Liuqing thought for a moment, and her beautiful eyes suddenly lit up. She said, if Martial Uncle is willing to teach him, I think he will quickly change his mischievous nature. That Prince Jin Li Han was taught by Martial Uncle. I remember Martial Uncle said that Li Han used to be very mischievous. The old man surnamed Wang did not doubt Her Highness's words. The fearless Imperial Prince Jing, after spending 3 days in the confinement room doing math problems, was now most afraid of Jianghu of Silla. He even took a detour when he saw Jianghu of Silla. He, Ningyuan, would rather hide behind a tree and wet his pants than see Jianghu of Silla. If it's Jianghu of Silla, perhaps it will be of some use. The old man thought for a moment, then shook his head and said, but His Highness Imperial Prince Jing will definitely be very resistant to this. Moreover, no matter what, His Highness is the son of the former emperor, the legitimate heir of the royal family. His Highness' teacher must also be a famous scholar. If he takes Jianghu of Silla as his teacher, I'm afraid there will be many troubles in the future, which will not be beneficial to the great cause. Her Highness Imperial Prince taking a teacher was already unimaginable. The Prince of Wu country, the future emperor, was taking the King of Jing country as his teacher. This was an unjustifiable matter. It was inevitable that people would gossip about it, and it would be detrimental to their future plans. Once it was used by someone with ulterior motives, it would become a great obstacle on their path forward. To be able to receive Martial Uncle's guidance is a blessing that he has cultivated for several lifetimes. Yang Liuqing looked out the window and sighed, I'm afraid that Martial Uncle won't be willing. The old man surnamed Wang thought for a moment and said, if he can become the teacher of the future emperor, why wouldn't Jianghu of Silla be willing? The emperor of the Jing kingdom is already half his disciple. Most of the princesses and princes of the royal family of the Jing kingdom are also Martial Uncle's disciples. What's the difference if there's one more Yang Fu or one less Yang Fu? Moreover, she withdrew her gaze from the window and murmured, moreover, Martial Uncle is lazy. Xuemo had been pregnant for several months and could not do strenuous exercise, but she still needed to walk more on weekdays. Li Yi walked with her for a while after dinner, accompanied her to Su Fuji's shop to taste a few new pastries, and then sent her back to her room to rest. Wei Liang sat outside with a pair of binoculars in his hand, staring at the street for a long time. If it wasn't for the fact that his other hand was not moving back and forth rhythmically where it shouldn't be placed, Li Yi would definitely think that he was doing something dirty. When Wei Liang put down the binoculars, he found Li Yi standing beside him and said with a face full of amazement, Your Highness Jianghu of Silla, if this thing is used on the battlefield, won't you be able to see the movements of the enemy from miles away with your own eyes? Li Yi felt a little sad for the people of the Wu kingdom. Binoculars had long been equipped in the army of the Jing kingdom. As a general guarding the border, Wei Liang's position was not low, but he had not even heard of it. Thinking that even the princes of the Wu kingdom would stand on the street and drool over candied fruits, all of this was not surprising. Do you like it? If you do, I'll give it to you. Li Yi was not a stingy person. The cost of this thing was not high. It was made from glass, so how much could it be worth? All the children in the stockade had started to play with glass marbles. For me? Wei Liang was stunned, and his voice trembled as he spoke. Li Yi nodded, for you? Wei Liang's expression was extremely conflicted. After a while he said with difficulty, no, this is too expensive. I can't accept it. Li Yi waved his hand and did not explain. He walked straight into the prince's mansion. Wei Liang held this magical tool that he named All-Seeing Eyes in his hand. It felt extremely unreal. Did this thing really belong to him now? After a while he finally accepted reality. His eyes were filled with respect and gratitude as he looked forward, even though that figure had long disappeared. His Highness Jianghu of Silla was really a very good person. Xuemo was resting in the room. Rui and Ruoqing went out. Li Yi strolled around the mansion. When he walked to the door of Yang Liuqing's courtyard, he stopped, turned around and walked in. She was now able to do a little exercise and was doing some recovery movements in the yard. Yang Fu was also in the yard, squatting at the door of the room to play with the crickets. When he saw Li Yi come in, his whole body shivered. He looked at his sister in the yard and was relieved. Uncle Master. Li Yi waved at Yang Liuqing, indicating that she did not need to be polite. Old man Wang was also in the yard. He seemed to be talking to Yang Liuqing about something. When he saw Li Yi come in, he nodded slightly but did not say anything. Li Yi looked at her and said, "I came to say that the weather is getting cold now. In a few days we will go back to Shuzhou. You should get ready and go back together." Yang Liuqing nodded gently and said, "Well, I know. That's all." Li Yi glanced at Yang Fu at the door and said, "I'm leaving, Uncle Master." When he walked to the door, a voice suddenly sounded in his ear. Li Yi could hear that Yang Liuqing's voice was a little hesitant. He turned to look at her and asked, "Is there anything else?" There was a hint of hesitation on Yang Liuqing's face. She bit her lip gently, then looked up at Li Yi and said, I have a presumptuous request." Li Yi asked doubtfully, "What presumptuous request?" Li Yi looked at her and found that her face was a little red. She spoke hesitantly as if she wanted to say something extremely embarrassing. He suddenly froze in place and thought to himself, it can't be, he was her Uncle Master. There was a gap in seniority between them. Rui would spank his butt until it was swollen. "Uncle Master, what do you think of Yang Fu?" Li Yi looked at Yang Liuqing and was stunned for a moment. Then he came back to his senses and said, "He's okay, compared to Prince Jin Li Han?" Compared to Li Han, this was a bit of a blow. Yang Liuqing looked at him and said, "In fact, although Yang Fu is a little naughty, his nature is not bad." Before she finished speaking, Yang Fu, who was squatting at the door and playing with the crickets, suddenly jumped up. His face was full of anger. He pointed at a maid who had just finished cleaning the room and came out of the room and angrily scolded, "Don't you have eyes? Didn't you see my mighty general? If we were in the Wu Kingdom, I would have already sent someone to chop off your head." The maid who accidentally stepped on the crickets turned pale and trembled all over. Li Yi walked over and patted the maid's shoulder. He smiled and said, "It's okay. You can leave first." After the maid left, he looked at Yang Fu. The latter immediately took a few steps back and said in panic, What do you want to do?" Li Yi only glanced at him and ignored him. He walked into the courtyard and looked at Yang Liuqing and asked, "What did you want to say just now?" Chapter 1057. With a pained expression, Yang Fu threw the cricket that was stomped to death by the maidservant aside and said proudly, "Luckily, I caught a state-guarding general that was even more powerful than the mighty general yesterday." Yang Liuqing looked at him, clenching and unclenching his fists. His eyes were filled with disappointment. Elder Wang sighed and looked up at the sky. Yang Liuqing took a deep breath and looked at Li Yi apologetically. She said in a low voice, "I'm sorry, Uncle Master. It's fine now, we're family. There's no need to apologize." Li Yi waved his hand and turned to leave. "Yang Fu." Yang Liuqing walked up to the young man who was playing with the cricket. Yang Fu looked up at her. Yang Liuqing looked at him and asked, "Have you finished today's math problems?" Yang Fu immediately nodded and said, "I finished today's 2 problems." "Very good." Yang Liuqing patted his head and said, "My royal sister will reward you with 10 more problems. Go and solve them. You can eat after you're done." Hearing this, Yang Fu's body trembled. He raised his head and looked at his royal sister who spoiled him the most. He suddenly felt that at this moment she was so unfamiliar. Unfamiliar yet familiar at the same time. His face was pale and his body was trembling. "Oh no, my royal sister must have been possessed. She must have been possessed by that bastard," he cried, heartbroken and heartbroken. "I don't want to write. I want to go back. I don't want to stay in this place anymore." After moving back to Shuzhou from the fringe, Li Yi had not seen the young man named Yang Fu. According to Wei Liang, His Highness King Jing had been in seclusion for the past 2 months, painstakingly studying mathematics. He must have made great progress. Otherwise, he wouldn't have cried tears of joy in the middle of the night. His cries could be heard from a courtyard away. For the first time, Li Yi admired Yang Fu. When Li Duan first started studying mathematics, he cried a lot. When he encountered a difficult problem, he could not solve it even after a long time. He cried even sadder than Li Duan when he was only a few months old. Yang Fu could actually cry tears of joy. He was simply the chosen one. Yang Liuqing's injuries were almost healed. She didn't mention anything about revenge anymore. She stayed by Mississippi Lu's side every day to help her deal with Lu Meng's matters. Everything seemed to have returned to normal, no different from a few years ago. Li Yi would occasionally see her sitting in the courtyard in a daze. Her eyes were blank, unfocused, and without direction. She was like a lost child, unable to find the way forward or the way back. Of course, when she was in front of others, she would put away all these emotions. No one knew how heavy her heart was. Wu Kingdom spies came back with some more news. Li Yi personally brought it to her. In fact, there wasn't any valuable news. Wu Kingdom was still as chaotic as before. The warlords were divided and engaged in a tug-of-war with the imperial court. If there were no accidents, this situation would continue for a long time. But no news was good news for her. The border armies that were loyal to her had been scattered a few months ago. If they were captured by the imperial court, in order to serve as a deterrent, they would definitely spread the news with great fanfare. If there was no news, at least it meant that they were living in harmony. After reading the news, Yang Liuqing's mood rose slightly. She bowed and said, "Thank you, Martial Uncle." Li Yi waved his hand. "You're welcome." Yang Fu walked out of the room and asked in a low voice, "Imperial sister, I finished my homework for today. Can I go out and play?" Yang Liuqing nodded. "Go ahead." Seeing Yang Fu run out, she looked at Li Yi. Her lips moved, but she didn't say anything. Li Yi looked at her and said in surprise, "Do you have something to say to me?" Yang Liuqing pondered for a long time. Then she looked at Li Yi and said with some begging, Can I hand Yang Fu over to Martial Uncle to discipline for a period of time?" Li Yi could understand how she felt when she said this. Yang Fu was her and these people's only hope. With Yang Fu around, they would have enough reason to resist the imperial court of Wu Kingdom. Only then would they have a reason to pull down the emperor of Wu Kingdom from the throne and help Yang Fu onto it. But this couldn't be their one-sided wish. If they could succeed in the end, Yang Fu would definitely sit on the throne. But the reality was that this emperor was somewhat unworthy of being helped up. When he was born, there was no red light, no colorful glow, no auspicious clouds, no beautiful stars, no auspicious clouds, no emperor's aura, no black dragon coming out of the water, no phoenix crying over the mountain, no white rainbow piercing the sun, and no sweet dew falling on the ground. His mother didn't carry him for 3 years, so he couldn't speak at birth. His appearance was also normal. He didn't have double pupils for breasts, long hands, a square face, and the lines on his hands and feet couldn't be written. There was no Yang Fu will be the emperor in the future written on it. He was just King Jing, a very ordinary prince. From birth until now, he didn't have the appearance of an emperor at all, nor did he have the fate of an overlord. But he had a very good temper. Even if this kind of person became the emperor in the future and wanted to brag about how awesome and extraordinary he was before he became the emperor, he couldn't find any material. So Old Man Wang sighed all day and Yang Liuqing was also unhappy. As Martial Uncle, Li Yi felt sorry for her. "It's not that I can't discipline him." Li Yi nodded and said, "It's just that my method might be a little different." "I'm worried." "Martial Uncle, you agree?" Yang Liuqing grabbed his arm and said in surprise. Looking at her hand that was grabbing his arm, Li Yi blushed. He looked around and said, "Don't be like this. It's not good if your master sees it." "I'm sorry, Martial Uncle, I'm too happy." Yang Liuqing hurriedly let go of him and said, "As long as you agree to discipline Yang Fu, I'll agree to any condition, and I definitely won't interfere with you." Li Yi secretly sighed and felt a little sad for Yang Fu. How could there be such a sister in the world? Wasn't she pushing her brother into the fire pit? Wasn't she not giving Yang Fu a way out? Were the two of them really siblings? Yang Fu was different from other children. He was a member of the royal family of the Wu Kingdom, a noble prince. Other children gathered in groups of 3 to 5, playing with spinning tops, playing with glass beads, fanning pictures, shooting birds with slingshots, and competing to see who could pee further. Yang Fu always played by himself. There were 2 reasons why he played by himself. First, he was self-conscious of his status and was unwilling to be friends with these lowly commoners in his eyes, nor was he willing to play with them. Second, he had offended Fat Tiger on the first day he came here. Fat Tiger was the king of the children here. If he offended the king, the children would be kind enough not to beat him up. No one was willing to play with him. Therefore, the 14-year-old Yang Fu could only play with mud by himself. Li Yi couldn't bear to tell him that the place he played with mud was where Fat Tiger and the others competed to see who could pee further. Who hadn't played with mud when they were young? Yang Liuqing walked out of the courtyard and said to Yang Fu, "Yang Fu, come here." Yang Fu raised his head to take a look. His royal sister seemed to be very happy. It had been a long time since she had been this happy. If his royal sister was happy, he should also be happy in his heart. But why did he feel a chill in his heart, and the surroundings were a little cold? He stood up and slowly walked over, obediently calling out, "Royal sister." Then, he quietly moved away from the person beside his royal sister. "I have something to tell you." Yang Luqing glanced at Li Yi who was beside her before looking at him and saying, "From now on, you must listen to Uncle Master's words. Whatever Uncle Master asks you to do, you must do it. You must listen to Uncle Master's words just like how you listen to me." Yangfu's body trembled and his face turned pale. He knew who his royal sister's uncle master was. It was the person he feared the most, second only to his second brother. He shook his head fiercely, his attitude firm. I don't want to listen to him, Yangfu, Yangliuking said in a deep voice. Yangfu shivered, and his voice came to an abrupt stop. His royal sister was his only family in this world, so he had to listen to her. Yangliuking looked at him and said, "Call me Mr." Yangfu looked up at Li Yi with a stubborn expression. He opened his mouth but nothing came out. Li Yi waved his hand and said with a smile, "There's no need to call me Mr." He was willing to help Yangliuking discipline Yangfu because he didn't want to refuse her and he didn't want to make her sad. He also didn't want to teach Yangfu knowledge, but he wanted him to change some of the bad habits he had developed for a long time, so that he could become a person that most people didn't dislike. Every time he heard the word Mr., the only thing that would appear in his mind would be the girl's tearful smile before they parted, and the figure standing on the palace wall. So, after leaving the capital, he wouldn't accept any more disciples and he wouldn't let anyone call him Mr. Yangfu wasn't and no one else would be. Chapter 1058. If Uncle did not want Yangfu to call him Mr., it meant that he would not accept him as a disciple. Yangliuking was a little disappointed, but she knew that Yangfu was still far from being qualified to be Uncle's disciple. She looked at Yangfu and said seriously, "You have to listen to Uncle's words just like you listen to me. If I find out that you have disobeyed Uncle's orders, I will not have you as my brother anymore." Yangfu shivered and said hurriedly, "Sister, I understand. I will be obedient." Yangliuking looked at him. A trace of pity flashed in her eyes, but it quickly disappeared. She knew that her words were a little harsh, but this was the only chance to change him. She looked at Li Yi and said gratefully, "Uncle, I will hand Yangfu over to you." Li Yi nodded and said, "He is still a child. It is normal for him to be a little naughty. As long as you guide him patiently, he will be able to correct his shortcomings." He said guide, but Yangfu's heart did not relax. He said that he would reward him, but in the end he gave him a very difficult book, elementary mathematics. Did he mean to guide him by beating him up? Yangliuking bowed and said, "Thank you, Uncle." Li actually did not have much experience in teaching naughty children. He felt that it was more straightforward to beat the child. However, of course he could not beat Yangfu. That would be bullying the young and he would never do such a thing. Mississippi Lu walked into the study and looked at Yangfu who was sitting at the desk. She then looked at Li Yi and asked, "Did you accept him as your disciple?" "No." Li Yi shook his head and said, "I only promised your disciple to help her discipline her brother for a few days." "You even know how to discipline people?" Mississippi Lu looked doubtful. He could not even discipline himself, how would he know how to discipline others? "What's so difficult about it?" Li Yi looked at her and said, "If a child is disobedient, just beat him up. What's there to discipline?" Yangfu, who had just written down an equation, shook his hand, and a blob of ink immediately appeared on the paper. His hand that was holding the pen trembled slightly. He had clearly promised his royal sister that he would guide her. How could he hit him? He was still a child. How could he not keep his word? "Hurry up and write. You can only eat after you finish." Li Yi looked at Yangfu and reminded him before walking out of the study. There was no point in trying to reason with him. He would not listen, nor would he be willing to listen. Therefore he would assign tasks to Yangfu every day. It might be homework, it might be for him to help out at a certain shop, or it might be for him to make friends with Fat Tiger and win 10 glass beads from Fat Tiger. He couldn't eat if he didn't complete the task. In order not to starve, he had to do things he didn't want to do. For a child of Yangfu's background, it was not strange for him to develop a proud and aloof personality. In the royal family of the Jing kingdom, there were many princes who were arrogant. Although Li Han used to be naughty, his nature was not bad. He could be considered as a clean stream. For a muddy water like Yangfu, it had to go through layers of filtering to make him forget his identity as a prince and adapt to being an ordinary person. Which was more important, eating or identity? He definitely had a clear idea. Mississippi Lu hugged her sword and leaned against the pillar. Li Yi stood at the door and looked at her. Li Yi watched for a while and asked, "Thinking about your disciple?" Mississippi Lu did not deny it. She said, "How difficult is it to do what they want to do?" "Almost impossible." In front of Rui, Li Yi did not need to hide. He said, "Even if you are willing to help her, it is almost impossible. Moreover, it will take a lot of time and many people will die. Many innocent and irrelevant people will die. Even so, the chance of success is still very small. If rebellion was so easy to succeed, wouldn't the change of dynasties be as frequent as the change of lovers between scumbags? The history of the Wu kingdom was longer than that of the Jing kingdom. It had occupied that land for more than 100 years. How could the regime be so easily overthrown? Li looked at her and said, "The price of rebellion is too high, and the success rate is too low. If you can persuade her to give up on this idea, it will be the best." The emperor of Wu country had a blood feud with Yang Luqing. As a martial uncle who was not related to her, it was not appropriate for him to advise her to give up on revenge. Second, young Mistress Lu was her teacher, her biological teacher. Only she had the right to say this. Mississippi Lu looked at him and asked, "If they go back now and start planning again, what are the chances of success?" "Not even 5%. What if we lend them divine punishment and weapons?" "Divine punishment is not omnipotent. No matter how sharp the weapons are, they can't be used if they are not strong enough. Just 5%. What if we have Lu Meng's help? On the battlefield, the strength of an individual will be infinitely weakened. 10%, no more than 10%. Even if we are lucky to succeed, Lu Meng won't have many people left." Mississippi Lu thought for a while and continued to ask, "What if I am her?" Li was stunned. He looked at her and asked, "You mean you are Yang Liuqing, the emperor of the Wu kingdom who killed our father and forced our mother to death?" Mississippi Lu nodded. Li thought for a moment and a smile appeared on his face. "Hee, I finished writing?" Yang Fu walked out of the study with a notebook. As soon as he opened his mouth, he saw the smile on Li Yi's face. He couldn't help but shiver and his hair stood on end. He forcibly swallowed the words he wanted to say. He quickly turned around and ran back to his seat. His body was trembling and his palms were sweaty. Mississippi Lu was basically asking how likely it was if he wanted to rebel. He had once helped the king of Shu rebel. The one-eyed stone man, the fish belly silk book, the fox spirit, the nursery rhymes. These were all Rebellion 1.0. Now it had been upgraded to Rainbow in Broad Daylight, the version 2.0 that came with the rainbow glow. As someone who was familiar with all kinds of revolutionary routines and was familiar with tunnel warfare, landmine warfare, guerrilla warfare, and on protracted war, he understood the united front, armed struggle, and knew that the country was surrounded by the city. He rolled up his sleeves and worked hard. At most, in 5 years at most, the Wu kingdom would change its surname to Li or Lu. Of course, if he only wanted to take revenge, no matter who the emperor was, he just needed to ask second granduncle to take the head of the emperor. Mississippi Lu crossed her arms and asked, "If you want to rebel, how many people will be left in the Lu Meng?" Li looked at her and said in surprise, "If I want to rebel, then I want to rebel. What does it have to do with the Lu Meng?" At this point there was no need to continue. Mississippi Lu had already gotten the answer she wanted. Li didn't want to lie to Rui. If he really wanted to rebel against the Wu kingdom wholeheartedly, even if he wasn't 100% sure, he had at least an 80% chance of success. The Wu kingdom was not like the Jing kingdom, which was as solid as an iron bucket. In fact, it was not even comparable to the current Qi kingdom. The Wu kingdom itself was on the verge of falling apart. Warlords rose up and the common people were displaced. The Wu kingdom was in dire straits and oppression was everywhere. From a historical point of view, it was very likely that a great man who could change the dynasty would emerge at this time. Li really didn't have much confidence that he could rebel in the Jing kingdom. But the Wu kingdom, he could write a letter to Li Xian and ask him to provide international assistance. Li Xian never thought it was a big deal. He could also shine the glory of the empress to the Wu kingdom and save the people of the Wu kingdom. He could also conquer the warlords of the Wu kingdom one by one, just like he conquered the chaotic land. If they didn't obey him, he could use divine punishment and cannon to crush them. He really didn't need the Lu Meng. But he didn't have any reason to do so. Was it just to help Yang Liuqing take revenge? If it was just revenge, Li could even ask second granduncle to take the head of the emperor of the Wu kingdom at the price of several chickens. However, they wanted to rebel and push Yang Fu onto the throne. Then what? Li Yi felt that the emperor of the Wu kingdom might not be very grateful to him. For example, now for no reason the emperor had an inexplicable hostility towards him. Yang Liuqing was his martial nephew, but he wouldn't use Rui, Li Duan, and Ruoqing Zumo as the wager for his martial nephew. He believed in Yang Liuqing, but he didn't believe in Yang Fu. Mississippi Lu's assumption didn't work, so all the questions she asked based on this had no answer. Chapter 1059. In just half a month, Yang Fu had changed a lot. Every day he would take the initiative to complete his homework. When he saw trash on the ground, he would bend over to pick it up and place it in the trash can. When it rained, he would help the people living on the street to collect the clothes that had not been collected in time. Helping the elderly cross the road was a common occurrence for him. In fact, Li Yi did not have strict requirements for him. Compared with Li Han, Yang Fu's life was simply too happy. He only needed to complete the homework that old Wang gave him, and then do 10 good deeds every day. He needed to do 10 good deeds every day to ensure that he would have food to eat the next day. If he did 10 good deeds, he would eat vegetables and rice. If he did not do 10 good deeds, he could only choose to eat soil or tree bark. Only by exceeding the minimum standards set by Li Yi could he have the right to eat meat. Of course, he also had other choices. Eating tree bark in the village was an act of vandalism. Once he was caught by the law enforcement team, he would be grounded. Being grounded would give him steamed buns, which was better than eating tree bark and soil. However, Yang Fu had not thought of this yet. Habit was a terrible thing. Whether he was willing or not, even if he pretended to do all these good deeds, as long as he could keep pretending, he would be worthy of the title of Top 10 Young Men of Willow Village. The name of the village, Li Yi, followed the name of Willow Village in Qingyan Prefecture. It was also in the mountains, and they also had the blood of bandits. It would more or less make Rui and the others feel a little bit like home. Yang Fu was the new Top 10 Young Men of Willow Village. It was not easy to get this title. The children in the village were all full of energy, or maybe their parents were full of energy. To get this title, Yang Fu had to exceed or double the task that Li Yi gave him. Whether he did it for King Jing's face or to not starve, at least on the surface, he was not as naughty as before. Yang Fu did not know when his sense of superiority disappeared. He could play glass beads with Fat Tiger and the others, fan pictures, and compete on the mountain to see who could pee further. Of course, he was usually the one who lost, especially in the last round. After the competition, he looked very sad, as if his self-esteem had suffered a great blow. Yang Liuqing and Prime Minister Wang noticed Yang Fu's change. Elder Wang looked at Yang Fu, who was picking up the trash on the ground and throwing it into the trash can. He sighed and said, "I've been teaching for my entire life and nurturing people for my entire life, but I'm still not as thorough as a young man." Yang Liuqing comforted him. Even the Wengu from the Qi Kingdom, who is well versed in Confucian classics and has students all over the world, has lost to Uncle Master. "Prime Minister, you don't have to worry too much." Her Royal Highness's way of comforting people was very unique. The old man surnamed Wang was stunned for a long time before he sighed and said, "Jiang of Silla knows everything and knows everything." "It's a pity?" Yang Liuqing looked at him and asked doubtfully, "What's a pity?" "Nothing much." As Yang Liuqing walked towards Yang Fu, the old man looked in that direction and murmured, "It's a pity that he isn't willing to help King Jing." Li Yi had long passed the stage of being a good teacher. In other words, he had never been a good teacher. What would happen if he taught an emperor? Would an emperor come looking for trouble with him? Not all emperors in this world were as stupid as Li Xian. Not all of them were so free that they would abandon their own families to help others rebel. When he first came here, he could be fearless when he didn't even have enough to eat. But now he couldn't. Li Duan was only 3 years old now. The child in Zue Mo's belly hadn't been born yet. He and Ruoqing didn't have a child yet. The longer he stayed here, the more he was afraid of death. He would first consider the risk before doing anything. He wouldn't do anything that was difficult and dangerous without any benefits. Although Rui didn't say it explicitly, they had been in cahoots for so long. They would always think of these things together. What was the point of rebelling? It was better to hug Yongning and listen to her talk about her childhood than to rebel. Yongning had told these things many times, and he had also heard them many times. Yongning never got tired of talking, and he never got tired of listening. 2 days ago it rained and thundered at night. Yongning ran to him in Rui's room barefoot. Rui hugged her and coaxed her for a long time before she fell asleep. A few days before the weather cleared, she slept with Rui. She looked up at Li Yi and murmured, "Brother, I miss Royal Sister. In the past, when there was thunder, it was Royal Sister who hugged me to sleep." Li Yi couldn't continue her words. He patted her head and said, "In the future, if you're afraid at night, go find Sister Rui or Sister Xuanhuan to sleep with you." Yongning nodded and looked at Li Yi. "But I still miss Royal Sister Shanning." Li Yi suddenly felt something cold at the tip of his nose. He looked up and saw snowflakes falling from the gray sky. "It's snowing." Yongning jumped out of his arms with a happy expression on her face. She stretched out her arms and spun around in the courtyard. Shu Province didn't have snow every year. Although it wasn't rare, almost everyone looked forward to the first snow every winter. This was also the cleanest snow of the entire winter. In her previous life, Yongning was born in a province in the south, and it was only after she arrived here that she had seen snow. Although snow was no longer that rare to her, she was still very excited every time it snowed. This snowfall was very heavy and fast. The ground was soon covered with a thin layer of snow. However, if she wanted to build a snowman and have a snowball fight, she would have to wait until tomorrow at the very least. After this snowfall, the new year was approaching. Time was about to enter the second year of Jingping, the capital. On the 23rd of the 12th month, when Li Xian walked out of his room, he discovered that a heavy snow had silently fallen last night. Hibiscus Garden's hair had turned white overnight. Soon it would be another year's court conference. However, as the emperor, he wasn't that busy. It was good to have Emingzu in court. If he had to handle all these things alone, he would definitely be flustered. He wouldn't be able to attend to the matters of the Academy of Sciences. However, it was impossible for Emingzu to help him forever. Ever since she started to limit the number of memorials submitted by the various departments of the court and gradually reduced it. Now, it had become one every 3 days unless it was an emergency. At that time, he knew that she would have to leave sooner or later. He couldn't blame Emingzu. In fact, he felt that he was a little selfish. If it wasn't for the restraints of the court, she might still be having fun with Li Yi. Thinking about it carefully, it seemed that he had really let her down. In the morning, a thick layer of snow had fallen in Hibiscus Garden. There were guards patrolling the palace from morning till night. The ground had been trampled out of shape. It was a little disappointing. He walked through the long corridor alone and headed in the direction of the Imperial Garden. There were many Imperial Gardens in the capital. Besides the Imperial Palace, there were also Hibiscus Garden and Xujiang Garden. Comparatively speaking, Hibiscus Garden's garden was the largest and the most beautiful. Everyone in the capital knew that the plum blossoms and Cold Mountain Temple were unique. Every year, countless people would go to see them. However, only a few people knew that the plum forest in Hibiscus Garden was not inferior to the plum blossoms in Cold Mountain Temple. It was just that other than a few members of the imperial family, no one else could enjoy the scenery in the garden. Leaving the first set of footprints in the snow-covered, spotless garden was something that gave him a sense of accomplishment. Li Xian walked to the entrance of the garden. When he saw that there was already a line of footprints extending into the garden, he immediately felt depressed. He walked into the plum forest and followed the footprints. When he saw the figure standing under the largest plum tree in the garden, the depression in his heart was swept away. He slowly walked over and softly asked, "Why did you wake up so early?" The girl was wearing a white robe. When she heard the voice, she turned her head and smiled. She said, "I woke up early. I couldn't sleep, so I got up and took a walk." Li Xian looked up and saw a red ribbon tied to a plum tree branch. Xianning would come here every day to tie a red ribbon. Now there were hundreds of red ribbons. From afar, the ribbons on the plum tree danced in the wind, adding some embellishment to the white world. It was the most unique scenery in this plum forest. He looked at the girl's elegant smile and thought to himself, "What a heartless fellow. He actually made me wait for so long in the capital and didn't even know to come back." He only had a vague idea of what he had done to Shuzhou. He also heard that he had conquered the entire land of chaos. Such an interesting thing, but he couldn't participate in it personally. He thought for a moment and suddenly said, "After the imperial court meeting, your sister and I plan to go to Shuzhou. We are going to patrol incognito. Does Xianning want to go with us?" The girl was startled. She suddenly raised her head and her face blushed. Her voice trembled as she said, Shuzhou." Li Xian nodded. I have to go back and ask mother." The girl's face instantly turned red and she quickly ran out of the garden. She ran in such a hurry that she didn't pay attention to her feet and accidentally tripped. Li Xian hurriedly went forward to help her up. However, the girl had already gotten up on her own. She didn't even have time to brush off the snow on her body. She staggered and jogged outside. When her figure completely disappeared, Li Xian sighed and said leisurely, "It's time to do an incognito visit." Chapter 1060. Hibiscus Garden was the largest royal garden in the capital aside from the imperial palace. Ever since His Majesty ascended to the throne, he had spent more time in Hibiscus Garden than in the imperial palace. The eldest princess, who had been promoted from assistant to head the government, also lived in Hibiscus Garden. Apart from the morning court session that was held every 7 days in the legislative hall, for the past 2 years, most of the memorials submitted by the various departments of the court were also sent to Hibiscus Garden. After the renovation of Hibiscus Garden, a few new palaces were built and the palace complex was expanded. His Majesty the Empress and Imperial Consort, the Empress Dowager, the eldest princess, and Princess Xianning all lived there. In the past 2 years, Hibiscus Garden seemed to be replacing the imperial palace. The officials were now used to not clashing with His Majesty on such matters. His Majesty lived wherever he liked. Even when His Majesty brought the Empress Dowager and Imperial Consort Yen over, no censor said anything, and no official from the Ministry of Rights said it was inappropriate. Ever since the matter of the jianghu of Silla came to an end, Prime Minister Qin retired, and Prime Minister Shin retired from the court. All the big shots in the court were promoted by His Majesty and eldest princess. The relationship between the emperor and his officials was particularly harmonious. Hibiscus Garden, Xiaoling Palace. Xiaoling Palace was the residence of Imperial Consort Yen. The Imperial Consort Yen mentioned here was not the current emperor's consort. The current emperor only had two consorts, the Empress and Imperial Consort Yen. Imperial Consort Yen was the former emperor's consort and the only one other than the Empress who did not have to live in a fixed residence in the Imperial Palace. By the window of the small pavilion, heavy snow was falling outside. The fire in the room was burning brightly without a trace of cold air. Imperial Consort Yen leaned against the window, holding a scroll in her hand. At some point, she looked down and saw a girl stumbling over from afar. A palace maid walked over slowly and said softly, "Imperial Consort, the princess is back." "I saw her." Imperial Consort Yen nodded. The girl had already gone upstairs. The palace maid hurriedly took the snow-stained robe. The girl took off her shoes, jumped onto the bed and burrowed under the covers. She rubbed her little hands vigorously, and her delicate little face was red from the cold. Concubine Yen put down the scroll and held her two small hands in her hands. She asked, "It's snowing heavily. What are you doing out so early in the morning? Did you fall just now?" Her hand was held by her mother. She said with a smile, "The plum blossoms in Furong Garden are in full bloom. They're even more beautiful than those in Cold Mountain Temple." Li couldn't guarantee that Yang Fu had turned over a new leaf and awakened some strange overlord attribute that could make the people submit to him with a stomp of his feet, make the emperor of the Wu kingdom bow down to him, give up the throne, and cut off his own head. However, his arrogant and willful personality was nowhere to be seen, and he was no longer as annoying as before. Li Yi felt that his mission had been completed, and he could report to Yang Liuqing now. This period of time could be considered the most stable period of his life in Shuzhou. The various reforms in Shuzhou had passed the most difficult stage, and what followed was a long period of development. With Chen Chong keeping an eye on everything, there wouldn't be any problems. The Land of Chaos had also officially changed its surname to Lu, and it was also in a stable stage of development. Wang Wei was leading a group of people to roll up their sleeves and start construction. All they needed was time. Drunk Mo's due date was the end of February, and there was less than half a month left. With Ruoqing and Rui by her side, she had been in a good mood. Ever since she started practicing martial arts, her physique had become much stronger than before. With a professional delivery team, she didn't have to worry too much. Fang walked in from outside. Li looked at him, but before he could speak, Fang shook his head and said, "No." He meant that there was no letter from him. Li Xian hadn't replied to him for almost 3 months. Not only Li Xian but Emingzu and Shanning also didn't reply. The letters he sent out were like stones sinking into the ocean, and there was no reply. No reply, right? He wouldn't write any letters this month either. He would reply when he received his letter. "Who's afraid of who, mister?" When Li Yi was sitting in the courtyard in a daze, he suddenly heard a familiar voice. This voice was too familiar, so familiar that he could recognize it with his bones. However, he hadn't heard this voice for a long time. Yang Fu wouldn't call him that. In the entire Shuzhou, in the entire Jing kingdom, no one else would call him that. Li Yi raised his head and looked at the girl standing at the door, looking at him in a daze. He suddenly stood up. Because he used too much strength, the stone chair he was sitting on was directly overturned by him. He looked at the girl, turned around and picked up the stone chair. He sighed and sat down again. He had been looking forward to their reply for the past 2 days. He had actually been hallucinating. How could he be in Shuzhou? How could he see Shou Ning in King Jing's imperial residence? "Mr. Crack." Li Yi broke the armrest of the stone chair. He stood up in disbelief and said, "Shanning, you, how could you?" The girl ran over but stopped halfway. Her eyes were full of tears, but there was a smile on her face. She said, "I missed you, mister, so I came to see you." When she ran over, Li Yi clearly saw the excitement in her eyes. He didn't know why she stopped. He thought for a moment and stretched out his arms. The girl was startled and then she rushed forward. Li Yi was knocked back a few steps by her. "Mister, I'm so happy." She hung on his body like a koala holding his neck. He didn't know whether she was crying or laughing. He could only hear her vague murmurs. Li Xian walked in quickly from the door. He looked at Li Yi and laughed. "You didn't expect this, did you?" Xianning hurriedly got down from him, wiped her tears, and stood aside in a very ladylike manner. As Li Xian walked over, he stretched out his arms and said, "Long time no see." Li Yi brushed past him and walked to the door. He said in surprise, "Where's Emingzu? Why didn't Emingzu come?" Chapter 1061. Emingzu. Li Xian was not angry at being ignored at all. A trace of embarrassment appeared on his face as he said, "Emingzu is busy with state affairs and doesn't have time to come over." Li Yi looked at Li Xian. 2 years had passed. Although his appearance and temperament had not changed much, the words he said were not like the Li Xian he knew. As the ruler of a country, he could stroll from the capital to Xuzhou, but he said that Emingzu was busy with state affairs. Was this something he could say as an emperor? Was this something a person could say? Li Yi finally couldn't help but ask, "When did you become so shameless?" "You flatter me." Li Xian cupped his hands and said, "I only learned half of your skills." Li Xian was being overly modest. "What 5%? It was at least 50%. Li Yi looked at him and asked, "Did you say she was busy with state affairs or did she say it herself?" Li Xian glanced at him and didn't answer. Instead he asked, "If you want to see her so much, why don't you go back to the capital to see her?" This conversation could not continue. Li Yi turned around. If he had time to chat with Li Xian, he might as well see if Xianning had grown taller and fatter. A girl changes 18 times between childhood and womanhood. After not seeing her for nearly 2 years, although she did not gain weight, she did grow a lot taller. Before she could not reach his chin, but now she could reach his nose. Xuanhuan. Li Duan ran out of the room and threw himself into Xianning's arms with open arms. Li Xian looked at him and asked, "What did your Li Duan say just now?" "Fragrant." Li Yi thought about it and said, maybe he was talking about the fragrance on her body. Royal sister. She had just put Li Duan down when Yongning pounced on her. Xianning had spent a long time with her. Other than Li Yi, she was the closest person to Yongning in this world. Li Duan and Yongning walked around Xianning. Li Xian looked around and asked, "Can't anyone see me?" Yongning walked over with a red face and said softly, "Imperial brother." When Li Duan saw Li Xian, he quickly ran over. Li Xian squatted down and smiled. "Dwainer is still the best." Li Duan ran to Li Xian's side, looked around and asked in disappointment, "Xiao Rui didn't come?" For an emperor to need to find a sense of presence like this, one couldn't say that no one would do it in the future, but Li Xian was definitely the first. This time he could be considered to be making a private visit in disguise. In truth, it didn't matter whether he was in disguise or not. There was no difference in the capital without Li Xian. Li Yi also didn't make a big fuss, only informing Qin Chong. In all of Xuzhou there weren't many people who recognized him. Although the shameless Li Xian had left Emingzu in the capital, and Li Yi was deeply resentful, Xianning had come here so he had to celebrate. Li Xian, he might as well bring him along. In the back garden of the estate, Li Yi had just started a fire. The servants of the estate were moving the things needed for the picnic to the side. Spring had just begun and today's weather was not bad. The cold of spring had passed and the sun was shining brightly. A picnic after a walk was just right. Drunk Ink couldn't get close to the fire, so she chatted with Rui and watching on the lawn in the distance. "This estate of yours is not bad." Li Xian looked at the garden. The green grass was like a carpet, and the fragrance of flowers assailed his nostrils. A dozen paces ahead, a clear stream flowed by, the sound of water babbling. In terms of size, only the hibiscus garden and Xujiang Manor in the capital could compare. Li didn't reply. After Li Xian became emperor, this bad habit still hadn't changed. Everything was good from other people's homes. In the past few years he had stolen many good things from him. Fortunately he couldn't move this garden. There was no point in being envious, and even if he liked it, it would be a waste. When he started the fire, Xianning stood by his side, holding a fan in her hand, patiently fanning away the rising smoke. She had really changed a lot. Other than the hug when they first met, there was no longer a trace of the arrogant princess. Li Yi was a little happy but also a little sad. She had finally grown from a little girl to a big girl. This was something that a girl had to experience in her life, and it was also a normal transformation. However, the pain experienced in the process of transformation was often heart-wrenching. Mississippi Lu was teaching Yang Liuqing martial arts on the lawn in the distance. It was said that she had encountered a bottleneck, and if she could break through, she would enter a new level. This made Li Yi feel a little depressed. His strength was already about the same as Yang Liuqing's, and now she had to temporarily shake him off. Her ultimate goal was Mississippi Lu and Mingzhu, and the 2 positions at the top of the heaven list. But now not only could he not defeat the bare-breasted and bum Bai Su, he couldn't even defeat Mississippi Lu's disciple. As for Rui himself, he was worried that he would succumb to her despotic power for the rest of his life. Li Xian looked into the distance. At a certain moment he suddenly turned around and said, "Did you notice that your second miss is a little different from before?" If even Li Xian could see it, it meant that Rui had really changed a lot. A few years ago, Li didn't even dare to think that she could actually become so gentle and understanding. Li Xian moved closer to him and whispered, "Tell me honestly, have you secretly taken her down?" "Take your sister." He couldn't take Li Xian's sister for no reason, but he also couldn't let him be a hindrance here. He waved to Fang and said, "Show him your treasure." Fang was suddenly shocked. Why? Li Yi just wanted to send Li Xian away, so he looked at him and said, "Don't be so stingy." Fang thought for a moment, looked at him and asked, "Here?" "Of course he's gone far away," Li Yi said snappily. Although that thing was small, it was very powerful. If one was not careful, it would hurt people. It was safer to go far away. Fang thought for a moment, looked at Li Xian and said, "Come with me." Li Xian followed Fang to a tree in the distance. Seeing him start to untie his belt, he was shocked. "What are you trying to do?" Something fell from Fang's body. Li Xian looked at something on the ground and asked in surprise, "What is this?" Fang looked at the thing on the ground and seemed to understand something. He put on his belt and said proudly, "You haven't seen it before, right? This thing is called the Red Barbarian Cannon. Of course, this is a smaller version, but its power can't be underestimated." Fang picked up a copper tube and a pedestal-like thing and introduced it to Li Xian. "You won't understand even if I explain it to you like this." Li Xian watched as Fang picked up a green brick from the corner and placed it on the ground. Then he placed the strange thing called the Red Barbarian Cannon on the ground. After fiddling with it for a while, he took out a square box from his pocket. He took out a small stick from the square box and used the tip of the stick to scratch the side of the square box. Whoosh! A ball of flame appeared in Li Xian's eyes. "What is this thing?" Looking at Li Xian's shocked expression, Fang was startled and smiled. "I forgot to tell you. This is called a match. You haven't seen it before, right?" Li Xian really hadn't seen it before. He was the dignified emperor of the Jing Kingdom and the president of the Academy of Sciences. Other than Li Yi, he could be said to be the most knowledgeable person in the Jing Kingdom, but today he was looked down upon. Not only that, he was looked down upon twice. Just like how he despised those stubborn and rotten scholars, he was actually despised by old Fang, who had never been educated. He suddenly felt that this trip was worth it. Otherwise, he might have missed out on a lot of interesting things. Seeing that Li Xian kept looking at the match in his hand, Fang's mouth pulled into a smile. To be able to despise an emperor made him feel a little accomplished. Li Xian looked at it and suddenly asked, "Is this real fire?" "Of course it is real," Fang said decisively. Li Xian stared at the match in his hand and asked, "Then why don't you feel any pain when your hand is burned?" Li Yi was listening to Xianning talk about her and Mingzi learning martial arts when he heard Fang's shout in the distance. He glanced in that direction. Wasn't it just to show the power of the mini cannon to Li Xian? Li Xian wasn't shocked, so why was he shouting? Chapter 1062. Bang. When Fang used the match to light the fuse, the strange thing he called the Red Barbarian Cannon disappeared in front of Li Xian. At the same time, the blue brick disappeared as well. The blue brick did not disappear, but was directly smashed into pieces. The scattered pieces fell to the side of Li Xian's feet. Fang ran to the bushes to pick up his treasure. Although this thing was small, exquisite, and powerful, the recoil was not small. Every time it was used, it would jump a few feet away by itself. Li Xian picked up a piece of the blue brick and put it under his nose to sniff it. He smelled the smell of God's punishment. Could God's punishment be used like this? The hard blue brick was simply too fragile in front of this little thing. If it was replaced with a human skull, it would not be much different. It was too fast, so fast that he could not see it clearly. This thing was too powerful. Although Li Xian's martial arts were not high, he estimated that even a martial arts master would not be able to defend against this thing. The mini cannon that had just been fired was a little hot. Fang put it aside to cool down, walked over and asked proudly, "How is it?" Li Xian looked at him and asked, "You just said that this is a smaller version. How big is the one that is not shrunk?" Fang thought about it and gestured a few times. He realized that he could not make a gesture at all. He shook his head and said, "In short, it is very big. You will know when you see it." Li Xian quickly walked to Li Yi's side. His eyes lit up and he said, "Give me one of these things. This is just a decoration. It is not very useful and it is also dangerous." Li Yi shook his head. The mini cannon was made by him for fun. Although it was powerful, the recoil was too strong. If an ordinary person held it in their hand, one shot would destroy their arm. Even someone as strong as Fang would not be able to handle it. He really did not dare to let Li Xian play with this thing. He also did not intend to let Li Xian study a normal-sized cannon. The Jing kingdom was still in the stage of stable development. They did not attack cities and territories. The Qi kingdom and the Zhao kingdom were now afraid of them. It was not very useful to have this thing, and God's punishment was enough. Of course, the most important thing was that they were now in the early stage of testing. Although there was a lot of information that could be consulted and used for reference, there was no guarantee that there would not be any mistakes. They had to slowly improve and perfect it. Li Xian sat on the grass and played with the treasure that Fang had just taken out. This thing could be considered a very powerful hidden weapon. Although after listening to Li Yi's explanation he already understood that this thing had a lot of limitations, it did not matter if it had shortcomings. If there were shortcomings they could just improve it. This was what the Academy of Science did. Not afraid of difficulties, not afraid of hardships, and daring to make mistakes. These were the basic qualities that a scientific researcher must have. Fang stood beside Li Xian with a vigilant expression on his face. The more interested Li Xian was in this thing, the more uncertain he felt. He was the emperor and the world was his. If he took a fancy to his treasure, should he give it to him or not? He looked for a while and finally could not help but squat down and said, "Have you seen enough? If you have, give it back to me." Yang Fu squatted on the other side and was scaling a fish in his hand. He had just heard the beautiful sister and his sister's martial uncle mention the two words, Li Han. In this world there were three people he was most afraid of. One was his second brother, another was his sister's martial uncle, and the last one was his sister. Of course, he was afraid of his royal sister because he didn't want his royal sister to be sad. He was afraid of his second royal brother because his second royal brother had killed his father and mother, as well as his eldest royal brother. If he went back, his second royal brother would kill him. He was afraid of his royal sister's martial uncle because he had locked him in a dark room to calculate problems and didn't even give him food. But if he had to say the person he hated the most, it was definitely Li Han. Although he had never seen Li Han and did not even know what he looked like, how good he was at playing marbles, or whether he could urinate as far as he could. But these were not important. What was important was that whether it was Prime Minister Wang or his sister, they always compared him with Li Han, saying how powerful and outstanding Li Han was. In comparison, Yang Fu was like an idiot, so he hated Li Han. He did not like anyone or anything related to Li Han. Therefore, when he found out that the beautiful and gentle sister was Li Han's sister, he did not think she was beautiful or gentle. He touched his chest. There was a snake sewn from a piece of cloth. Fat Tiger had lent it to him to play with. They often used this thing to scare girls. Girls were all afraid of snakes, and Li Han's sister was no exception. She looked even prettier than Fat Tiger's sister, Fatya, and looked even more gentle than Fatya. When she talked to his sister's martial uncle, even her eyes were smiling. She must be more afraid of snakes than Fatya. In the past few months he had already understood that as long as Fat Tiger and the others could do it, he could do it. Using a fake snake to scare girls wouldn't be punished. While Li Han's sister was washing her hands at the stream, Yang Fu quietly followed behind and threw the fake snake into the grass at her feet. He pointed at the grass and said loudly, "Snake, there's a snake." Xianxia had squatted down to wash her hands by the stream, but she seemed to be startled by the sound. She waved her hand randomly in the grass beside her, grabbed something and threw it out. Yang Fu was indeed startled when he saw Li Han's sister. He laughed loudly and caught the fake snake, saying loudly, "Coward, that's fake. Are you talking about this?" Yang Fu saw the girl standing by the stream and turned around. She held something in her hand and waved it in front of his eyes. He saw clearly that it was the fake snake he had just thrown. If she was holding the fake snake, then what was the slippery, long, soft and moving thing in his hand? Li Yi was roasting Xianxia's favorite mushrooms when he suddenly heard a scream from the stream. When he turned his head, he saw Yang Fu running over from there, his pants wet. His face was pale and he shouted as he ran, "Snake, there's a snake." Yang Fu, who often used fake snakes to scare girls with Fat Tiger, would actually be scared by snakes. Li Yi shook his head and looked at Xianxia, who was walking over from the stream. He seemed to understand something. After learning martial arts from Emingzu for 2 years, she was no longer the girl who would be scared by things like mice and snakes 2 years ago. Even Yongning was not afraid of these things. He had found the wrong person this time. Xianning walked over and looked at him with some grievance. She said, "Sir, there was a snake in the grass. I didn't know he was so easily scared. He was so scared by a snake that he peed his pants." Forget it, forget it. It's not the first time he peed his pants. Li Yi waved his hand and handed over the roasted mushrooms. He said, "Try it?" "Thank you, sir." She reached out to take it and used chopsticks to feed Li Yi a piece before eating it herself. Not far away, Yang Fu, who had already changed into a pair of pants, looked over with fear in his eyes. She was so beautiful, looked so gentle, and smiled so sweetly. She wasn't afraid of snakes. She actually used snakes to scare him. Her gentleness was fake and her smile was fake. It was all fake. He finally understood a principle. He couldn't provoke anyone around his royal sister and martial uncle. Xianning had been by his side for the past few days, and Li Yi hadn't seen Yang Fu for a few days. Of course, it wasn't just Xianning. Li Xian had also been inseparable from him these past few days. Li Xian had never been to Shuzhou, but he had been heading west from the capital. He knew that the further west he went, the more desolate it was. Only when he reached the westernmost Shuzhou was everything different. Although the construction of the city couldn't be compared to the capital, in terms of commercial prosperity, the current Shuzhou couldn't even be compared to the capital. Other than here, there was no place like the Jing Kingdom, Qi Kingdom, Zhao Kingdom, and Wu Kingdom that allowed free trade like Shuzhou. Especially after seeing the shopping mall that Li Yi had described to him in the letter at the West Gate, Li Xian knew what kind of place Shuzhou would become in the future. The two of them climbed up the city wall and looked down at the bustling crowd below. Looking at Li Xian's expression, Li Yi casually asked, "Do you regret it?" "I don't regret it." Li Xian shook his head and said, "If I hadn't promised you this back then, there wouldn't be Shuzhou today." He suddenly looked at Li Yi and asked curiously, "If you were to govern the Jing Kingdom in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, what would the Jing Kingdom look like?" If it wasn't in public, Li Yi had the urge to kick Li Xian off the wall. Their family had already lost Emingzu, and Li Xian still wanted to do something to him. Was he worthy of the departed former emperor? Chapter 1063. The previous emperor was wise throughout his life, but the biggest mistake he made was to pass the throne to a fellow who was always thinking of pushing the empire away. You should give up on that thought. This was Shuzhou. Li did not have to give him face. He said without any room for negotiation. "Are you going to stay here for the rest of your life?" Li Xian was not angry at all. He looked at him and asked, "Are you not going to return to the capital?" "Not going back." Shuzhou was a beautiful place with beautiful mountains and clear waters. Its geographical location was unique. Why would he go back to the capital? If he went back to the capital, he would encounter all sorts of disgusting things. Li Xian asked again, "Do you want Emingzu to spend the rest of her life alone in the capital?" Li Xian's words were getting more and more hurtful. This was also the reason why Li Yi did not want to bring him along. "Why do you think she doesn't want to come here?" Li Xian glared at him and said, "Even I know that she doesn't want to come here because she is afraid that once she comes here, she will never want to go back." Li Yi could not answer him. "Emingzu even gave you her hair. How dare you say you don't want to go back to the capital?" Li Xian looked at him and shook his head. "You heartless man. Young master, first Miss asked me to call you back to eat." Fang stood on the city wall and looked at them. He did not finish his sentence and turned around to go down the city wall. Li Yi sighed. Li Xian did not understand Emingzu. The Jing Kingdom could not do without her. Li Xian could travel thousands of miles from the capital to Shuzhou because of a sudden thought, but she would not. She could not let go of things that Li Xian could easily let go of. She was more like an emperor than Li Xian. When Li Xian arrived at Shuzhou, he found everything new and interesting. He was even more fascinated by the industrial base in the depths of the fringe. However, Drunk Mo's due date was approaching, and Li Yi had no time to accompany him, so he had to ask Wang Wei to send someone to pick him up. So far, it was still in the early stages, and the more mature ones were probably smelting and forging. As for the chemical industry, he only dabbled in it. Some time ago he made a match, but it was the most primitive and simple. It was not very safe and it was still being tested and improved. In a short period of time, it was impossible to put it into production. Fang's box was just for fun. He just wanted to show off in front of Li Xian. Li Xian stayed there for 7 days. When he came back, he was a little different. His reaction was also within Li Yi's expectations. The Academy of Science mainly focused on theoretical research. Improving farming tools, grinding lenses, inventing some ingenious gadgets, making a model of the solar system, and so on. It could only be considered as a small-scale project. The shock brought about by these things was far less than seeing a cannon destroy a building 2 kilometers away. In comparison, what Li Xian did in the Academy of Science was almost like playing house. He sat next to him and looked at him with a strange look for a long time. Li Yi sighed and said, "Don't look at me like that. This thing is too heavy. If you want to carry it back, it will be time-consuming and laborious. Moreover, the research has not been completed and a lot of experiments have to be carried out. Even if you bring it back, it will only be a semi-finished product. There is no need to waste so much effort." Yang Liuqing walked into the room with a pile of clothes and soon came out again. He said, "Uncle Master, I have put your clothes in the room." She was the princess with the least airs of a princess. In order to learn from a master, she put down her pride and became a servant in the Li family for a few months. She served tea, swept the floor, and did the laundry. She took all of Xuanhuan's work, and Xuanhuan complained to him many times. Now that she had regained her identity, she still did not put on airs. Everything was almost exactly the same as before. Li Xian did not continue the topic of the red barbarian cannon. He looked at Yang Liuqing, who was walking out of the courtyard, and asked, "Is this the princess disciple of your second miss?" Li Yi nodded. Li Xian thought for a while, looked at him, and asked, "Do you accept her?" Li Yi asked doubtfully, "Accept what?" "Accept her." Li Xian had really changed. Back then, he had confidently told him that he would only love the empress in this life. In the end, not long after he left, there was an imperial concubine in the palace. In the blink of an eye, he had slapped his own face. A while ago he was still calling him Brother Shin, and not long after he slept with his own brother. To be friends with this kind of person, one had to be on tenterhooks all the time. Accept her as a concubine? What concubine? That was Mississippi Lou's disciple, his martial nephew. Wasn't this the same as messing around? Xuanhuan was already 19 and she was Rui's servant girl. It was impossible for her to marry someone else. Rui had reminded him many times, but he still could not lay his hands on this adorable little girl. Li Xian still wanted to cause trouble for him. Li Xian took a sip of tea and asked, "Are you not going to help her?" "Oh. The red barbarian cannon will blast all the way. The Wu kingdom does not even have Tianfa. Which city can stop that thing?" Li Xian still could not forget about the red barbarian cannon. Li Yi thought for a while and said, "Why don't you lend me 100,000 soldiers, and I will give you the red barbarian cannon. We can flatten the Wu kingdom." Li Xian felt a little regretful and said, "This is a good idea. Unfortunately, if we really do this, the Wu kingdom will no longer be called the Wu kingdom. The Jing kingdom today could not be compared to 5 or 6 years ago, especially in terms of military strength. If it was not for the fact that Li Xian and the court officials did not have any intention of expanding their territory, this would be the best time to make the Wu kingdom change its surname. With 100,000 soldiers, Tianfa, and the cannon, it was enough to flatten the Wu kingdom. However, this was definitely not what Yang Liuqing wanted. She had never mentioned revenge to him. Li Yi knew that she was struggling and hesitating in her heart. Sometimes he could not bear it. As a woman, she carried too many things on her shoulders. However, it was not easy to let go of her parents' vengeance. He could only sigh. This decision was too important. Even he could not make it easily. In a room somewhere, Yang Fu put down his pen and said, "Prime Minister, I finished today's homework. I'm going out to play." Prime Minister Wang walked up to him. After checking, he corrected a few mistakes for him. Then he nodded and said, "Go." It was not until Yang Fu ran out of the room that he sat down at the table and looked out of the door. Her Highness had completed her homework very well. A few small mistakes did not matter. In the past, if Her Highness could calm down and finish her homework, he would definitely be overjoyed and would give her a lot of encouragement. However, King Jing, who was about to turn 15, had a lot of important things to do. He could not let others supervise his homework forever. These days, the faith in his heart that had never been shaken had been shaken many times. "Prime Minister." Yang Liuqing walked in from outside the door. Prime Minister Wang stood up and bowed to her. Then he thought of something and asked, "Your Highness, do you know who the young man who has been with Jiang of Silla these days is?" He was a little confused. He had been observing Jiang of Silla for a long time. Jiang of Silla was the ruler of Shuzhou. When others talked to him, they would be respectful. No one was like that young man who was casual and unrestrained. Also, Jiang of Silla treated him very differently from others. "Li Xian," Yang Liuqing said. "Li Xian." Prime Minister Wang thought about this name. He felt it was a little familiar, as if he had heard it somewhere. Seeing his confused expression, Yang Liuqing added, "He is the current emperor of the Jing kingdom." In fact, there was no need for her to add. Old Minister Wang had already remembered. Wasn't the young emperor of the Jing kingdom called Li Xian? He had a shocked expression on his face. He stood up and said in disbelief, "He is the emperor of the Jing kingdom. How could he leave the capital and come to a place so far away from Xuzhou? What about the court? How could the officials agree to it?" Yang Liuqing shook her head. She and Li Xian only knew each other. She did not know about these things. Old Minister Wang sat back down. He stroked his beard with a blank expression on his face. He felt like he had grasped something, but it also seemed like he had grasped nothing. But in the end, something was quietly growing in his heart. Chapter 1064. Li Yi realized that Old Man Wang, who was by Yang Liuqing's side, had been asking him more and more frequently. In the past, 90% of the questions he asked were about the difficult problems in the book, elementary mathematics. Recently he didn't ask about these anymore. Instead he asked about some reform matters in the Jing kingdom. The Jing kingdom had been carrying out reforms in the past few years. Some succeeded, some failed, but in general the reforms were still developing in a good direction. Now the court had found a long-term path that could stabilize the strength of the various classes and improve the lives of the people at the bottom. It was suitable for the development of the Jing kingdom. It wasn't difficult for other countries to know the specific measures of these reforms. They could send some spies to live in the capital for a year and a half, and they could personally and deeply experience all the changes brought about by the reforms. Of course, Old Man Wang had been on the run with Yang Liuqing. Every day he would think about how to avoid the pursuit of the court of the Wu kingdom and how to restore the dynasty. He didn't have the time or energy to investigate these things. If he was willing to investigate, these were not secrets. Therefore, when Li Yi was free, he wouldn't deliberately avoid this topic. Old Man Wang asked a few questions, stroked his beard and asked, "I heard that other than the East Palace, there is also a West Palace in your country?" The West Palace that Old Man Wang mentioned wasn't referring to the harem in the usual sense, but Mingzhu's Morning Dew Hall. At the beginning of the 5th year of Jinghe, the previous emperor was gravely ill. As the crown prince, Li Xian took charge of the government and entered the Eastern Palace. Although Mingzhu was the assistant, Li Xian's position was only a pretense. All the matters of the court, big or small, were actually all decided by Mingzhu alone. Gradually, no matter if it was the officials of the court or the common people of the capital, they all got used to calling the place she lived in Western Palace. This habit had been used until now. Li Xian devoted himself to scientific research and didn't care about the court affairs. In name, Mingzhu was an assistant, but she exercised the power of the court. Therefore the name West Palace became even more famous. There was no need to hide this from Old Man Wang. However, after he heard it, he seemed to be in a trance. He kept muttering, "How can this be, and how can this be?" Then he left in a daze. Li Yi shook his head. Old Man Wang had always wanted to help the Yang Liuqing siblings restore the dynasty, but now the hope was actually very slim. The old man was already old, and whether or not he could withstand this blow depended on his own willpower. He didn't think about it anymore. Drunk Mo would give birth at the end of this month, or at the beginning of next month at the latest. Other than this matter, everything else was a small matter. When the old man surnamed Wang walked into a study, Yang Fu was holding a book and shaking his head. Seeing him walk in, he hurriedly said, "Prime Minister, I'm going to memorize it soon. Give me another 15 minutes, just 15 minutes." The old man surnamed Wang stood at the door and looked at Yang Fu with cloudy eyes. He stared at Yang Fu for a long time, making Yang Fu feel weak. He said with a sad face, "I just secretly played for a while. Prime Minister, don't be angry. I'll memorize it right away, right away." The old man surnamed Wang walked over, shook his head and said, "Your Highness, you don't have to memorize these things anymore." Yang Fu's body stiffened, and then his face became even paler. He sat on the ground and hugged the leg of the old man surnamed Wang. Tears and snot flowed down his face as he cried, "Prime Minister, I beg you, don't tell my sister, don't tell that person. I won't be lazy anymore, I won't be lazy anymore." The old man surnamed Wang bowed down and helped him up. He shook his head and said, "These things are not what your Highness should learn. From today onwards I will teach your Highness something new." Yang Fu wiped his tears, felt a little relieved and stood up from the ground. The old man looked at him and asked softly, "Your Highness, do you still remember what your Highness' mission was?" "I remember." Yang Fu wiped his snot and said, To overthrow that traitor who killed his brother and father, and to save the millions of people who are in dire straits. The old man nodded and said, Your Highness is the future emperor. To be an emperor, one man is the sky with great power to judge the situation, to make the best use of everything, to make the best use of people, to have a broad heart to accommodate the world, to have a broad mind to accommodate all rivers. To be an emperor, you don't have to be knowledgeable, you don't have to be able to compose good poems, you don't have to be able to write beautiful essays, but you can't lack the spirit of an emperor. Yang Fu didn't really understand, but he still kept nodding his head. This is the way of an emperor. The old man pulled him to sit down at the table and said, This is what the previous emperor should have taught your highness. Now that the previous emperor is gone, this old subject can only overstep his boundaries. The old man pressed his two hands on his shoulders, and with a solemn and respectful expression, he said in a serious tone, Your Highness King Jing, you have to grow up quickly. Yang Fu could only nod his head. I hope that your highness will listen carefully to what this old subject is going to say next, and remember it. The old man stood up and said slowly, The way of a ruler is to retreat and think of treasures. Don't worry about your own affairs, and you know your own blessings and blessings. Yang Fu nodded his head and listened carefully. Gradually, the frequency of his nodding began to slow down, slower and slower. This subject does not need to be domineering, do not need to be greedy, follow the emperor's instructions. The voice of the old man with the surname Wang gradually became softer. He looked down at King Jing, who was lying on the table blowing bubbles with his snot, and sat down at the table opposite him. He looked at Yang Fu, who was sleeping soundly without any expression on his face. He was motionless like a dead tree, a stone tablet. The days in Suzhou were actually quite boring. Li Yi yearned for days where he didn't need to worry about anything. He could eat and sleep and occasionally bask in the sun when the weather was good. But if he lived like this every day, wouldn't he be bored to death? In the past, he could still tease Mississippi Lou when he had nothing to do, and add some fun to his dull life. But now Rui had become gentle and she didn't fight with him anymore. No matter what he did, she would just laugh it off. The last bit of fun in his life was gone. Fortunately, Xianxia had been staying by his side these days. In the past, she was always mischievous and always had some strange ideas. Although she was a little naughty, it was still a young girl's nature. Now she was like a completely different person. After not seeing her for 2 years, she already had the gentle temperament of a noble. However, whether it was the old Xianxia or the current Xianxia, she made people feel happy just by looking at her. As long as she was by his side, his mood would be inexplicably better. This time, when Li Xian went out incognito, many experts from the palace were deployed. Some followed him to the land of chaos, and a few stayed behind to protect Xianxia. An old nanny followed Xianxia closely, but Mississippi Lou felt that the old nanny was not strong enough, so she asked Bai Su to follow her closely to ensure her safety. These few days she and Bai Su, who had no breasts, no buttocks and liked women, had gotten to know each other. In the small courtyard, Xianxia held a long sword in her hand, and Bai Su only held a willow branch in his hand, helping her to practice. Xianxia had been practicing martial arts for 2 years. With Mingzhu's guidance and the countless books in the palace, 2 years of practicing martial arts was equivalent to 10 years of practice for others. Although she still couldn't make it into the heaven and earth role, she could be considered as a minor expert. Of course, she was still far from the Bai Su, who had no breasts and no buttocks, but was ranked 8th on the heaven roll. That's right, just 2 days ago Bai Su had defeated the original 8th on the heaven roll and replaced him. Li Yi felt it was a pity. Although Bai Su's figure was a little flat, she was still pretty. How could she fall in love with a woman? She was so nice to Xianxia, so Li Yi was a little worried. Could it be that she had feelings for Xianxia? She was only 16, just a child. Women were always very sensitive to men's gazes. Therefore, when Bai Su noticed that Li Yi had been sizing her up for a long time, she stopped feeding Xianxia, turned to look at him and said, Your Highness Jianghu of Silla, if you're interested, why don't you come up and have a spar? Li Yi shook his head without hesitation. There was no need for a spar. With Bai Su, his image as an idol had long collapsed. She just wanted to take revenge on him for patting her chest and stealing her woman. Bai Su glanced at him with disdain, walked forward, picked up the teapot and gulped down a few mouthfuls. Li Yi watched her put down the teapot and thought to himself that an expert was indeed an expert. Even drinking tea so boldly, he thought about it and asked curiously, Miss Bai, you're not young anymore. Haven't you thought of finding someone to start a family with? Thinking of this, Bai Su's heart was a little angry again and she glared at him. Li Yi sat a little further away and said, Don't look at me like that, we're not suitable. Su clenched her fists and her chest rose and fell a few times. Suddenly she smiled and asked, "In the Jianghu of Silla family, does anyone use lily-flavored perfume?" "No." Li shook his head. Ever since Zuamo got pregnant, no one in the residence, from the master to the servant girls, used perfume. Su suddenly walked forward and gave him a gentle hug. With a smile on her face she said softly, "Thank you for your concern, Your Highness Jianghu of Silla. I will consider what you said carefully." Li was stunned. He just said it casually just now, he didn't expect Su to really consider it. He suddenly felt a little guilty in his heart. From now on, in this world, he was afraid that there would be another man who would suffer. Then he seemed to think of something and looked at her and asked, "What did you say just now, what lily-flavored perfume?" "Nothing, just casually asking." Su smiled, walked into the courtyard and said to Shanning, "Let's continue." "Inexplicable." Li shook his head, stood up and walked into the courtyard inside. Zuamo should be giving birth in a few days. Rui, Ruaching, Yangliuking and Third Miss Chen were all in the courtyard. "Stop." He walked over and said a few words. When he was about to walk back to the study he was stopped by Rui. Rui walked over and walked to his side. She frowned and murmured, "Lily-flavored perfume." Li was stunned. When he raised his head he saw 5 pairs of eyes in front of him looking over. "You're tuning in to this Sword Dance in the Vast Sky YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.